Hello, I'm Eric Jessen. This is a video history of how the Orange County Park System was established during its first 110 years, beginning in 1897. I'm Eric Jessen, and I'm retired Chief of Planning, Acquisition, and Development for Orange County Harbors, Beaches, and Parks. And I started with the department in January of 1975 and was there for 30 and a half years.
Right. We were talking earlier about the park system sort of came together in 3 chunks.
Yeah, I think we could characterize it, the earlier, what I'll call the historical period, dates way back to 1897, when James Irvine donated the first 160 acres for Irvine Regional Park, which of course subsequently grew over the years. But there were a number of other interesting and what led to be major recreation facilities of great importance to the residents of the county that came along not too long after that, beginning in 1906, for example, with Sunset Beach, which is one of the big wide beaches in the county, and then the 1911 Lower Newport Tidelands, which ultimately gave birth to Lower Newport Harbor, and then some other beach facilities such as Camel Point Beach and Table Rock Beach and Laguna, and also in Three Arch Bay in the 20s. I'll call that early historic period. I'll take it up to about 1949. A lot of people are unaware that places like Aliso Beach County Park in South Laguna and even the very first acquisition for Dana Point Harbor took place as early as 1949.
And what was driving those acquisitions?
I think it was just some good quality thinking and stewardship on the part of individuals who worked for the county of Orange in those days, and in some cases actually members of the Board of Supervisors who took it on themselves to mandate, for example, a 5th District Supervisor, Alton Allen, who would mandate to the county staff, look, I want to have a harbor in Dana Point, or I want to have this beach at Aliso, and they'd have to go to work to make those things happen. Also, there was kind of an organizational force that was underway, because in 1934, the citizens of the county had a proposition essentially on the ballot. The question before them was whether or not to establish a harbor district in Newport Beach for the purposes of dredging and creating Newport Harbor, which everyone saw as a potential great economic boom if we could get a recreational harbor of some magnitude going in Orange County. And I think the underpinning for that was traceable back to the simple fact that back in the late 1800s into the 19s, it was quite common for a lot of commerce to take place along the county shoreline using ships. For example, the early construction in San Clemente, Dana Point, Laguna Beach, and parts of Newport, the construction materials weren't brought by land. They were brought by ship out of Anaheim Landing and up by Sunset Harbor in the Seal Beach area and brought to shore. You know, so these southerly coastal towns got their start with shipping assistance, and then of course that transition into recreational yachting and a demand for that, which, you know, so I think that the establishment of the Harbor District, and the voters approved it in 1934. It was established in, I believe, January of 1935, and it broadened, its purposes were broadened over the years to include what they called harbors, beaches, and parks. Because the second big wave of growth in the harbors, beaches, and park system was beginning around 1969 and through 1974-75, the first big spurt of regional parks began to be established. And this was really all enabled by the visionary master plan of regional parks, which the Board of Supervisors adopted in 1962, which was written, by the way, by a gentleman named Dick Ramella and Al Bell, who were both county planners, young county planners, maybe a half a generation ahead of me. And that master plan laid the groundwork. You know, it identified all of the, you know, essentially the ecological wonder spots in the county that today we would call ecological hot spots. But back then, they were just looked upon as being aesthetically attractive, places like Laguna Lakes or and so forth. So getting back to that middle growth spurt, we had everything from Craig Regional Park and Featherly Regional Park and Laguna Niguel Regional Park, Salt Creek Beach Regional Park, Mason Regional Park, the Talbert Nature Preserve, Miles Square, Clark Regional Park, Yorba Regional Park, culminating in probably what I would still characterize today as having been the finest moment in the system, I think, was in 1974 when the Board of Supervisors purchased Caspers Wilderness Park, because it was, at the time, 5,500 acres, which was the first really big park that we took on, and still to this day is our second largest park after Limestone and Whiting. And in so doing, they preserved one of the very finest examples of the pre-development early Southern California landscape, and it's totally intact. And then in 75, before Caspers was even ready to be open to the public, they knew that politically they had to get it open right away, because they had a vote of all 5 supervisors unanimously voted to buy Caspers. But one of them, the chairman of the board.
I was just going to ask you, who was the landowner?
The landowner was originally Eugene Apperson Starr and his wife, who purchased the Starr Ranch, which was a 10,000-acre sliver of land between what we call the present-day Rancho Mission Viejo and the Cleveland National Forest. It was a linear 10,000-acre stretch of land from the Ortega Highway leading up to what we now call Dove Canyon. And when the Starrs passed away, they bequeathed 4,000 acres to establish the National Audubon Sanctuary, and developers got their hands on the 5,500 acres downstream of the Audubon Sanctuary in Bell Canyon, which is today Caspers Park. It was Japanese investors that originally had control of it, and then in working closely with some Newport Beach developers, and that's who we bought it from.
What was the emphasis behind buying Caspers?
I think it was twofold. First of all, the impetus for buying Caspers was driven by the need for sand and gravel, And to get that essential vote from the longtime chairman of the Board of Supervisors, Ralph Dietrich, who was absolutely determined that we get Caspers Park for sand and gravel and that we were going to mine it for sand and gravel. Other colleagues of his on the board weren't quite so interested in doing that, but it was an interesting convergence because it at least helped tip the scale to go ahead and acquire Caspers. But obviously the real driving force behind the acquisition was merely the threat. You know, urbanization was beginning in the early 70s to take off with such wildfire pace, particularly in the South County, which had essentially been protected for generations because of the legacy of large ranch holdings that are traceable back to the Spanish and subsequently the Mexican land grants and their successors, such as the Irvine ranch and the Rancho Mission Viejo and the Whiting Ranch and the Moulton Ranch and some of these others. But and getting to the role of the citizen activist, Caspers Park has a mother. She's still alive. Her name is Ilsa Burns. She lives in San Juan Capistrano, and she was an excellent example of a local in whose backyard, literally, this transformation of this pristine landscape would have taken place in much the same way that Jean Watt had to witness the transformation of a mudflat into
Linda I.
right outside her backyard. But fortunately, you know, things happen. So I think it was a combination of, you know, the threat of development and the need for the sand and gravel resource, you know. Fortunately, the sand and gravel never happened, but that took a lot of cat and mouse chicanery on the part of individuals like myself who had to work behind the scenes as county staffers and manage not to get ourselves fired by resisting the chairman of the Board of Supervisors. And we did it, I think, pretty cleverly because we had an open house in April of 1975 for Caspers Park. And this is the first time the doors were thrown open for the public to come in and see this magical wonderland. And I just happened to be a graduate student in biogeography at Long Beach State, and I had a seminar in recreation geography, and I developed a questionnaire, essentially, to be handed out to the public. And I think there were about 1,700 people that attended on that open house day. And many of them got this questionnaire, and it's, you know, what would you like to see in the park, like camping and fishing and picnicking and the benign questions. But then there was this loaded question down at the bottom. Would you support the mining of sand and gravel in the park? And we took the results of that survey, and I went back to Long Beach State and converted it all into a statistical surface diagram in my cartography class. Pushed the button on the primitive computer and developed a map that showed the response to that question by supervisorial district. Okay? And so we had this statistical surface map of Orange County showing this high rise of resistance in the 5th district, which is where the park was located. And actually, the citizens in all 5 supervisorial districts were opposed. More than half. The closest sentiment in favor of sand and gravel was in the 1st district, which is right downtown in the Santa Ana, Westminster area, because they lived in concrete jungle already and didn't mean that much to them. But even the majority of residents that attended that open house from the 1st district were opposed to it. So, you know, that questionnaire essentially morphed into the development of a general development plan, which was what we always did. We acquired a piece of parkland, and then the first thing we would do would be to develop a general development plan, hiring a consultant. In this case, it was Ernie Reynolds and Associates. And then as that plan would develop, and there would be public workshops and the opportunity for the public to come in at different venues and different community centers to have a say in shaping the future of this park and finalizing the master plan, well, that presented the opportunity to keep bringing that sand and gravel issue to the surface. And then finally, something very interesting happened. You know, it was still teetering on the brink of potential sand and gravel excavation when, bless his heart, chairman of the board, Dietrich, had an architect named Leon Rose who the board saw fit to hire to design the new Board of Supervisors building, which is the upside-down pyramid in downtown Santa Ana in the Civic Center. And they had been headquartered over on Broadway at Santa Ana Boulevard in a smaller, really overcrowded building. So they hired Leon Rose to design this building. Well, with the passage of time, a couple of years later, it came to light that the chairman of the Board of Supervisors had received a $100,000 kickback from Leon Rose, the architect of the building. Now, they both went to jail. Well, that pretty much nailed the coffin shut on sand and gravel at Caspers Park. So there you are. I came on board at Caspers myself in December of November, December of '74. I was a landscape contractor living in the Villa Rockledge in Laguna Beach, where I was landscaping this National Historic Site, and somebody told me that there were going to be some job openings at the county, and there was a notice published in the Times, LA Times, and there were 30 job openings that were going to be hired, funded by the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, which was a stimulus money to help offset the then economic recession we were having at the time, which was making my landscape business kind of bad. So I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning when I lived in the Villa Rockledge and jumped in my Volkswagen, and I was in line in Santa Ana, number 29 in line, at about 4 in the morning. And by the time the doors opened at 8 in the engineering and finance building, there were 900 people in line. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't know that they had any jobs with harbors, beaches, and parks. I knew about harbors, beaches, and parks. When I was in both an undergraduate and a graduate student, I had interviewed people like H. George Osborne, who was the chief flood control engineer, and Carl Nelson, who ultimately became the public works director, in doing research, for writing research papers in school. And as a result of knowing about harbors, beaches, and parks, I wanted to go to harbors, beaches, and parks, to go to work for them before then. And I'd go down and file the little blue cards and the interest cards and stuff. But in those days, the system was so nepotistic, you couldn't get a job at the county unless you had relatives working at the county. And if you looked in the county phone directory in those days, you'd see a distinctive name like Novello, which isn't that common. And there were a spate of Novellos, you know, because they hired family. So it was literally impossible. I managed to sneak in through the back door by going in the building and finding out that they were hiring 8 members, laborers, to go to work building trails at Caspers Park to get it ready to open to the public. And so the guy doing the interviewing was Tony Gimbroni, who was the park ranger, too, in charge of Caspers Park. Park was still closed, but they were managing it as a resource, you know, and they had wildlife and all kinds of stuff to look after. And he interviewed me, and he told me, he said, you know what? He said, you're way overqualified for this job, but I'm going to hire you anyway. So I went to work at Caspers. And my love affair with the park essentially starts with that. But Unfortunately, one day, the park was very, very sparsely staffed, and one day we used to pick up the payroll on Friday mornings. You had to go down to Harbors, Beaches, and Parks headquarters right here at 1901 Bayside Drive in Corona Del Mar to pick up the payroll, and the guy that usually did it was sick that one particular Friday, so they sent me down to go pick up the payroll, and I walked in the lobby of the headquarters down here on Bayside Drive to pick up the payroll, and Larry Lehman, who was the then acting director, successor to Kenneth Sampson, was standing at the front counter talking to the harbor master and spotted me. He knew me because I was on a team that wrote a new general plan for O'Neill Regional Park a couple of years earlier, because I was a planner as well. So Lehman saw me in the lobby of the harbor headquarters, and when I answered his questions, and he was surprised that I was working for the harbor district, why he came up to me and said, "You report here on Monday morning." So I was swept out of Caspers Park and brought down to headquarters because I had done a master plan for one of the regional parks, and they didn't have anybody with that expertise. They had a really first-class design group headed up by Ralph Hudson, and an operations group headed up by Joe Cardello. And then Larry Lehman, who was heading up the administrative part of it. So that's how I snuck into the system, and they didn't have any office space for me at 1901 Bayside Drive, but they had a really nice library with a round table with some chairs, kind of like where Jean is sitting over in her dining room. And they had this wonderful library of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks related books and volumes and earlier master plans and historic documents and whatnot. And it was waterfront. It was a waterfront office, and that's where they stuck me. And right at that time, the board had previously voted to consolidate and create the first super agency in Orange County, which was going to be called the Environmental Management Agency. So all of the former fiefdoms, independent fiefdoms, such as Harbors, Beaches, and Parks with its own director, and Building and Safety with its own director, and the Planning Department with its own director, and the Flood Control District and Public Works with their own directors, were all merged into this big pyramidal super agency with H. George Osborne at the top. And within a short time, everybody got sucked out of their wonderful, cushy geographic office locations into the centralized location in downtown Santa Ana. So all of the people from Harbors, Beaches, and Parks had to deal with this mental difficulty of leaving a Newport Bayfront ocean or waterfront office facility and going to downtown Santa Ana. But I didn't have to go. They left me behind. And I was alone in the Harbor District facility, working in the library, writing my reports on the geology of O'Neill Park, or, you know, wildlife corridors at Caspers Park, and these kinds of things. And I would report, I knew that it was important to be seen, so I would go down to Santa Ana, and they had a cubicle for me there, I would, you know, go in and see Larry Lehman and stuff. And then finally one day he said to me, "Eric," he said, "it's time. You have to come." So, that was a real hard thing to do. But I went to work in Santa Ana, and we were shortly thereafter the kind of the top of the food chain of the Environmental Management Agency was moved into 811 Broadway, which was a rented mid-rise building about 6 or 7 stories tall, with Earl's Bar and Grill on the ground floor, which is where all of the politicking and cigar smoking and cocktail drinking took place, where the Board of Supervisors used to make their deals with the lobbyists and all this. And on the 4th floor was H.G. Osborne's office suite as the director of the Environmental Management Agency, and his 4 program managers, one of which was Larry Lehman, in charge of the Open Space Recreation County Service Area Program Office, and that's where I worked. So I had exposure, right, to Osborne and Richard Munsell, who was the planning guy, and Bill Zahn, who was the road czar in the county, and Novello, who was the administrative guy, and Larry Lehman, for whom I worked. And I was one of the few people that always brought my lunch and ate in the office. I didn't go out and eat in restaurants at lunchtime. There was one other guy that did that. His name was H.G. Osborne. So he and I were always alone in the office executive suite at lunchtime. And I would notice that after lunch, he would dutifully always go in to brush his teeth in the bathroom. I always did the same thing. And one day we crossed paths in the bathroom, and he looked over at me and said, "Good hygiene habits." I thought, well, that's the first time this guy ever spoke to me. But anyway, we kind of became buddies over the fact that we brushed our teeth together. And with the passage of time, I was beginning to be eager to get reclassified. They still had left me classified as a laborer for as long as they could, and paid me $2.25 an hour. $2.25 an hour. And eventually I did get classified to a junior planner, but I knew that I had good skills, and to make a long story short, I had applied for a principal planner job in Marin County at the world famous Frank Lloyd Wright Marin County Civic Center, which I had always fantasized would be a fabulous place to work. And
Do you remember what we were talking about?
yeah,
Okay.
we were talking about me brushing my teeth with H.G. Osborne and bonding with him, pardon the pun. And then I had this job opening in Marin County, which had hundreds of applicants from all over the country, because Marin County is a very desirous place to work. And it was a principal planner position. And somehow I made it to the short list, and unbeknownst to me, on a Friday afternoon, H.G. Osborne got a phone call from the county planning director in Marin County, checking on the validity of, did I really exist, and was I a good, reputable person and a good hard worker, because they were going to offer me the job. And I didn't know this. I was sitting in Larry Lehman's office about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, and Osborne sauntered in with a PID, which is called a Personnel Action Card, and that's what always had to be signed to promote people and reclassify them. And I was a junior planner, and they were stretching it out, working hard, making very modest living. And he sat down and he said, well, in his kind of aristocratic silver fox, we called him behind his back way, he said, well, I just had a call from the planning director in Marin County, and I understand that you have been looking for a job elsewhere. And I go, I have? I didn't want to admit to that, but he said, well, you're about ready to be offered this job. So what, we don't want to lose you. So here, we'll just reclassify you. So he signed the thing, and they reclassified me to Planner 2, which was a good start. And I worked in the department for a few years before. 5 years after I started, I was promoted to chief of Planning, Acquisition, and Development by Bob Wingard, right at the time, shortly after he had become the program manager, when Larry Lehman had left to go to become a director of various county departments, the Community Services Agency at first, later Healthcare Agency and Social Services Agency, which he retired from as director. He always, Lehman was a really good mentor, and he really deserves a huge amount of credit, because he, to my way of thinking, he brought on that big middle spade of regional parks, the particularly what we call the urban regional parks, like Miles Square and Laguna Niguel and Mason and Yorba. That's where the needs were. the acquisition opportunities to expand the system really didn't present themselves until we got to what I'll call the third, or the big bump up in the growth of the harbors, beaches, and park system. 1977, the voters approved, or 78, I can't remember which, the voters approved Proposition 13. And shortly thereafter, the county executive officer, Robert Thomas, and Adrian Kuiper, the county council, co-authored a letter to the Board of Supervisors alerting them that, as an example, this wonderful master plan of regional parks that had been in place since 1962 was never going to be able to be implemented. Given the old paradigm of the county building up money and going out and buying park lands, and that if the system was going to keep pace with the growth in the county, the population growth, there was going to have to be some other way. So the board adopted or authorized the Environmental Management Agency to commence this big project of modernizing the general plan. And I was put on a team to write what they then were going to call the recreation and open space elements of the modernized general plan. My colleagues that worked with me were Tom Matthews, who ultimately became county planning director, John Busis, assisted by people like Chuck Shoemaker, and people like Gary Medeiros, who was the real mover and shaker on my staff, my real henchman, and myself. And we literally sat down and wrote the modernized recreation element that replaced the old 1962 general plan. The guy we were working for was Al Bell, who was the manager of general planning. And it was Al who spent a weekend figuring out how are we going to overcome this dilemma of implementing this system with dwindling tax revenues in the county's coffers because of the imminent effects of Proposition 13, and a light popped on in his head. And he came in one Monday morning and called us into his office, and he said, the regional park system will emerge as a result of urbanization, not despite urbanization. That was a euphemism for saying that the developers were going to be required to dedicate these huge tracts of land for future, to add to existing regional parks and to establish new regional parks as overriding environmental mitigations, public benefits for the entitlements that they obtain for building their new planned communities, such as Aliso Viejo, such as Rancho Santa Margarita. So essentially, the first big opportunity to get a big piece of land from the development community came in April 17th, 1979. Is the date the document is dated. The Mission Viejo / Aliso Viejo company was required to make an irrevocable offer for 3,400 and some odd acres in Aliso and Wood Canyons in return for the development entitlements to build the new then planned community called Aliso Viejo. The negotiations that took place were pretty rancorous because it was the first time a developer had to do a big land dedication, and they were kind of resistant and pretty darn difficult, and they used their top guns pretty much to try to minimize the corporate damage in making these big dedications. But actually, Jack G. Robb, who was the vice president of engineering, and Van Stevens, who was the vice president of planning for the Aliso Viejo company, actually showed up at my front door at my house on a Saturday morning at 463 Bluebird Canyon Drive in Laguna Beach to browbeat and intimidate me into backing off. And I simply stood my ground. And I was just this planner. I think they had temporarily promoted me to planner 3. Okay, and we actually sat down in my living room and hashed out the final details that they could swallow, and some of the concessions that I had to swallow, like their ability to continue to graze cattle until we accepted the land, which damages the resources and suppresses the natural regeneration that would have occurred among the sycamores and the willows and the things in Aliso Canyon that were destroyed over 200 years of intensive grazing from the days of the Verdugos, when that historic Hispanic family owned what then later became the Moulton Ranch, and then the Moultons and so forth. But that was the beginning of it. That dedication from the Aliso Viejo Company is traceable to the policies that we crafted in writing the modernized Orange County General Plan, in this case the recreation element, which the Board of Supervisors adopted in 1980. We wrote it in 1979, they adopted it in 1980. The policies were then also connected with a series of implementation programs, including an acquisition program and a development program for the park system and a financing program for the park system. So that's there was actual policy in the general plan that didn't require the developers to make the dedications, but it enabled the county to condition the developers to make the dedications if they came in and wanted entitlements for large new communities or other. Didn't have to be new planned communities. Even in some cases, it could have been a public project, like a major highway project, where they acquired, let's say, for La Paz and Alicia parkways that, strangely enough, unlike many places in the county, have huge green belts running down one side of them. Well, those were ultimately excess road right-of-way that was acquired to build these major arterial highways, and yet those had environmental impacts. So even public projects that the county undertook themselves wound up leaving legacies of open space. After Aliso Viejo dedication took place, then we began to see commensurate with the rapid urbanization that was taking place in the county and the demands for the growth and expansion and the new housing needs and the new employment needs. We had what I'll call the big bump era, with major facilities following Aliso Wood Canyon, such as Riley Wilderness Park in Coto de Caza and Whiting Ranch Wilderness Park, followed by the early acquisitions for Laguna Coast Wilderness Park in the Upper Newport Bay Nature Preserve, and then the Limestone Canyon irrevocable offer in 1989, which, when combined with Whiting, its neighboring park, then becomes the biggest park. Caspers then becomes number 2 in size. And good because it's strategically located dead center in the middle of the county and is easier to get to than Caspers. Then Weir Canyon Regional Park and Peters Canyon Regional Park and Harriett Wieder, although small on the bluffs overlooking the Bolsa Chica lands, and then some very important historic facilities like Arden, Madame Majeska's historic home and gardens in Majeska Canyon, Irvine Ranch Historic Park, which is the old headquarters site of the Irvine Company, and for many years after the company moved in 1964 to its high-rise in Fashion Island, the company still ran its agricultural operations out of the Irvine Ranch Historic Park. And we laid the groundwork also for parks that didn't open or still not yet open, negotiating, for example, that portion of the Tustin Lighter Than Air Station for the Tustin Air Station Regional Park site. Fremont Canyon Nature Preserve, Baker Canyon Nature Preserve. And going back to that modernized general plan that the Board of Supervisors adopted in 1980. Another thing that we were able to carry forth from pioneer thinkers like Dick Ramella and Al Bell, I think it was back in that old 1962 master plan of regional parks, they actually identified the military bases that were in Orange County as potential future regional park sites. We had these huge ones like Los Alamitos Naval, Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station, Los Alamitos Naval Air Station, obviously El Toro Marine Corps Air Station, Tustin Lighter Than Air Station, and what they called the HOLF Airfield, aka Mile Square Regional Park. So the first of the military sites that came in a big way was when Richard Nixon established his urban parks legacy, and for $1 we acquired, about 400 plus acres of literally, minus the center triangle of 137 acres that the federal government kept for an emergency landing field in Fountain Valley. That's Mile Square Regional Park, which was established by, and implemented by Larry Lehman and his staff. But that essentially set the groundwork with the inevitable downsizing of military bases in the United States, setting the stage for knocking off a park site in Tustin at the Lighter Than Air Station, and then ultimately a project that is outside of the Harbors, Beaches, and Parks / OC Parks program, the Great Park in Irvine. But the enabling legislation for the Great Park was written by us at the county in the general plan and always carried forth from decade to decade to decade, laying the groundwork for still what is and what will ultimately happen at the Great Park, even though it has its own authority and it's not part of the official county park system. So my job basically was to negotiate the dedications and to essentially shape and identify how much land we wanted, which was all basically driven on natural topographic characteristics. You wouldn't want just a canyon bottom, you'd want the walls of the canyon and the housing to be set back from the rims so that you could have a beautiful park, and the physical setting wouldn't be compromised by urban runoff or conflicts with people's private backyards. Nevertheless, it was a never-ending battle. But so I think basically, we got these historic parks as well, not to be overlooked. Never forget, the biggest recreational demand in this county or any urban county in the United States along the coast is beaches. It's not parks. The biggest recreational demand is for beaches, and we haven't talked too much about them other than that some of the historic beaches, the first actual dedication of beach together with access easements to get to the beach that we know of in California was in 1924 at Camel Point in Costa Royale Beach in South Laguna. That's the first one we know of statewide. I can't say with certainty that that's the only one. There might have been something in Humboldt County or San Francisco County that we don't know about, but like we know that Irvine Park is the oldest regional county park in the state, we also think we have the oldest public beach in the state. There were Salt Creek Beach that came on during Lehman's tenure, was actually one of the driving forces that led to the passage of the California Coastal Protection Act, because it was the developers' determination in Laguna Niguel that they were just going to completely emasculate and wipe out that whole area, and they were grading around the clock with big, huge Klieg lights, in the middle of the night, trying to beat the general election because they kind of saw the handwriting on the wall that the Coastal Act would be approved. But after Salt Creek Beach, we had other beach parks that we established, such as Capistrano Beach Park, filling in the private ownerships that the banks in many cases owned. For example, Capistrano Beach Park was owned by United California Bank. That's who I negotiated with to acquire that. Some overall observations complementing the regional harbors, beaches, and park system. There were two other major systems, one of which was the county regional open space system, of which we acquired more than 5,000 acres of lands. And good examples of those are the Anaheim Hills open space, which was 950 acres, the Colinas Bluffs, which is the gateway to San Juan Capistrano, which is 400 acres, the Salt Creek Corridor in Laguna Niguel, another 400 acres. Those are big chunks. And then the same policy language that enabled all these facilities also led to the ultimate preservation of the Dana Point headlands. It wasn't undertaken by harbors, beaches, and parks directly under their wing or within their organization, but the enabling language and the policy language that enabled the private environmental activists together with the various nonprofits like the Trust for Public Land and some of the other groups that helped to pull the Dana Point Headlands Preservation Program together. And then the other big recreation open space program was the system of community and local and neighborhood parks, keeping in mind that most of the South County was unincorporated, so the County of Orange was the local park agency for the unincorporated area, in addition to being the regional park agency under the umbrella of the Harbors, Beaches, and Parks system. So we established about 1,200 acres of local and community parks, including major ones like Crown Valley Community Park and El Toro Community Park and those kinds of facilities. So when I got there in '75, we had 7,000 acres in the system. There was only 2,000 until we bought Caspers, and it got bumped up to 7,000 acres. And when I left in 2005, we brought it up to 41,000. Major milestones, I think, I talked about Proposition 13 and how that ultimately triggered this requirement for the land dedications. The policies that were set in place in 1980 that enabled all of that to happen. There were a couple of other milestones. In around 1985, when the County of Orange General Fund was reaching its GAN spending limit, the county saw fit to dissolve the Harbors, Beaches, and Parks District and merge it with the county in order to raise their spending limit. But fortunately, when they dissolved the Harbors, Beaches, and Parks District, County Council did see to it that County Service Area 26 was established as a separate funding arm to safeguard the assets of the Harbors, Beaches, and Park system. And so when the state legislature approved and the governor signed the legislation to dissolve the district, all of the requirements were in there requiring the County of Orange to keep all of the Harbor, Beaches, and Parks assets, their land assets, their grant funding, their property tax revenue, and their concession revenue, and everything separate, and to be used strictly for park purposes and not for other county purposes. But that was a big milestone that took place. And then on a personal level, I think another milestone was between 1995 and 97. 1995, our Harbors, Beaches, and Parks director was Bob Fisher. And he had come to us as a former planning director at the county. And he was a pretty broad-thinking guy. And he knew that in 1997 we were going to have some sort of a celebration for Irvine Regional Park, because that was going to be the centennial park year. So in '95, he put us to work starting to plan for that centennial. And I'll gloss over all the details, except to say that when it all came down to engaging the individual members of the Irvine family, I developed a personal love affair with all of them as individuals. From Katie Wheeler, who was the matriarch of the Irvine family, the daughter of Catherine Irvine, James Irvine II's middle child, Linda Irvine Smith, the daughter of Myford Irvine, later on Joan Irvine Smith, the daughter of James Irvine III. But actually, little did I realize that in all the fun of planning for the centennial for Irvine Park that culminated in 1997, once my post-retirement activities would transition and be enabled by my love affair with the Irvine family, because ultimately what I wound up doing is doing environmental consulting for the museum industry, starting with the Irvine Museum. And my job is to find spots where famous historic plein air paintings were painted. And so Joan gave me the assignment, Joan Irvine Smith gave me the assignment to find the spots where Joseph Kleitch painted all of his monumental plein air canvases, which was pretty easy because most of them were in Laguna Beach. And then the last 2 years I've been working on identifying the spots where Edgar Payne, another big-time plein air artist, painted his canvases in the Eastern Sierra. So I've been hiking hundreds of miles, not without the assistance of others. But I wanted to just kind of reflect that it was an enormously gratifying job I had. I always thought of it as being the best job in the county. I kind of thought, maybe the other fun job would be at the airport, but then when I realized that the airport employees at John Wayne were in a concrete bunker over on the west side of the landing field, I said, forget that. So, my great-grandfather and his brother settled in Santa Ana in 1869, and the county was good to them. And even though I was born and grew up in the Beverly Hills area, I came back to Laguna Beach on my own in 1962, and it was good to have a career where I could give something back for future generations. Here on the northwest tip of Harbor Island, about ready to meet Gene Watt and Jim Irvine for a nice little visit, and we're looking at the county's most expensive private encroachments onto public land, the Harbor Island Tidelands encroachments. This was originally the estate of world-famous violinist Jascha Heifetz, which later became the home of Howard Amundsen, who founded Home Savings and Loan. And as Harry pans across the channel, we're looking at Linda Isle, named after Linda Irvine Smith, and we'll have an interesting story about that today from Gene Watt. We are essentially on a public beach on private Harbor Island in the Orange County tidelands of Lower Newport Bay. The other thing that we were going to do was, in our video program, we have talked about the encroachment program that we embarked on in 1977, where we had 147 homes on the beach in Sunset Beach that had private encroachments onto the public beach. All of which were abated. They got to keep 15 feet out and nothing else beyond that. And then, of course, the big ticket item was the Harbor Island encroachments.
Yeah. And
you were the only one that didn't have any.
I know.
So you have clean hands.
Well, I had $250 worth the first round when they first decided to do an assessment. We have one planter.
Okay.
There's a deck out there.
Yeah.
And about a foot of the deck, unfortunately,
Oh,
is in the
okay.
tidelands.
Okay.
So I would have had to cut that off.
Yeah.
And then there's a planter. So it would have been easy enough to just get rid of
Yeah.
it. But when they first assessed
Yeah.
us, it was by the amount that you had intruded.
Right.
And so
The square footage or something.
mine was $250 a year.
Yeah.
And I thought, fine, that's okay.
Yeah.
And then other people had these huge assessments.
Oh, yeah.
And they fought it.
They did. It went on for almost 10 years, and if I recall, was his name Dennis O'Neill?
Oh, yes.
And he was the attorney that
He
represented.
was the attorney, yeah.
But prior to that, was he the city manager or a council
No, he
member?
was the city attorney.
Okay, the city attorney became the
Yeah.
Harbor Island attorney.
Yeah,
Right.
and then he went on the council.
Oh, after
And
that.
then he was an attorney, and I was on the council with him.
Okay.
It was a joke because we said, as soon as you had 4 votes,
Yeah.
call Dennis,
Oh.
because he wanted to be on the winning side no matter what it was.
Okay.
Anyway,
Yeah, they stayed it. They were polite about it. It was just a long negotiating process. They realized that there was no way that the county could legally give them any tidelands because the county doesn't own them. They're owned by the state, and the county is the trustee.
Yeah.
And that trusteeship was transferred to the county in 1911.
Mm-hmm.
And they somehow decided to cut the baby up, and some of the tidelands were county and some were city.
That's
So
right.
there's a couple of one area of Harbor Island, that end.
Brenn's area. Yeah.
And
Maybe that's, I don't know.
Amundson's were here,
Mm-hmm.
and Overholt's were here, and the one guy that you homeowners apparently, if I recall correctly, because he's the one I dealt with all the time, was McNabb.
Oh, okay,
And he was old Scottish guy or Irish or whatever.
he was a real estate guy.
Yeah. It was called McNabb Irvine Real Estate.
Yeah, I guess.
And he and his wife would sit in their house like we're sitting here, and we would chew the fat. And I was very, I wasn't like coming onto them like, as a hard-nosed bureaucrat. I was treating them very, very politely. And eventually we had everything surveyed and the square footage calculated, and depending on the nature of the encroachments and how substantial they were, the more substantial they were, they added value back onto the house, to the private property. Like Elizabeth Benvenuti, if I recall correctly, had a swimming pool.
Yeah.
Okay, so that added value to the home. Reset, real property value, even though it wasn't on their property. So that was all factored in. After the death of Myford Irvine in 1959, his wife, Gloria, and their son, James Myford Irvine, moved out of the Irvine Ranch House down to number 5 Harbor Island, right next door to the home of Gene Watt at number 4 Harbor Island, who decades later founded the Friends of Harbor's Beaches and Parks, and who was declared in 2013 Newport Beach Citizen of the Year. 47 years had passed since Jim and Jean had a conversation. And so, on the 6th of December, 2017, Jim walked into her living room for a reunion conversation. He thought that it would be a nice touch to enrich this comprehensive history of Orange County Park System with this conversation between Gene Watt, who played such a critical role in support of the Orange County Park System, and James Myford Irvine, whose family has left us a vast legacy of regional parks in Orange County.
Where have you been anyway? My gosh, I haven't seen you for
forever.
30 years or so.
Yeah. And this is my fiance, Susan Jessen. Gene Watt.
Nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Wonderful, yeah. He was a cute little guy.
Yes, he is. He's still
Still a
cute.
cute guy.
He's still cute.
Yeah, right. Yeah. You used to take my kids over to your fort or something. I don't know what you did.
You had a fort?
Well,
Well,
it wasn't a fort, it was some
We
kind
had
of
the
a...
beach. We were always digging up the beach and making big channels and things on the upper layer of the beach.
That's pretty cool.
You have a similar look to some of the Irvine people, I can. You are an Irvine person.
I'm an Irvine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Myford and Gloria Irvine.
I got
Right.
2 kids and they got the look too.
You have 2 kids, so
Yeah.
how old are
They're
they?
37.
Yeah, I forget.
Twins. Jamie and Jory.
And are
Boy
they
and girl.
around here?
No, Jeremy is in Los Angeles and Jory's in Las Vegas.
Oh my gosh, yeah. All right, that's handy. You can go visit them and you don't have to.
And they do.
Yes, we do.
You do?
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Oh, yeah, I wish you still lived next door. I preferred you. Your mom was adorable. Gloria. She was the one that said, when you get old enough, you can wear a purple hat. It doesn't matter, you know.
I hope you're picking this up, Harry.
That would have been my mom.
Yes,
It would have been the kind of thing she would have said.
yeah, I liked her.
So I have a story, and I'm either going to
Would you
amaze
like to sit down and?
Yeah, let's sit down for a minute and have a
Okay,
little.
we can go over here and,
lived here
yeah.
until about 1968, 69. And then we left here to move. Mother was having a home built down in Laguna Beach, on the point there, Avalon Point, Irvine Cove.
Right.
But we actually lived for a summer at the Balboa Bay Club, because I guess this, I don't know this, but I guess that this house sold faster than the new house was ready.
Probably.
And so we moved to the house at Avalon Point, and I lived there. My mom passed in 1971, and I stayed in the house until about 4 years ago, and just became time to sell it, and did that, and moved out to Costa de Casa, and been living out there ever since.
Well, that's very nice, I'm sure.
Oh, it's
As
beautiful.
long as you don't get a fire or something.
As long as we don't get a fire, it's yes, we have that.
So scary.
But it's nice to be able to put a piece of metal furniture out and not have it corrode immediately.
Well,
so.
that may be true, or airplane gunk.
Yeah.
coming
Oh, yeah.
out.
No, or just the noise too.
Yeah.
My mom told me a story, and as I have retold it many times, I want to confirm it, but I also don't know if she ever told you the second half of this story. Okay, so here's the story. One of your children, and we're going to come back to how your children are all doing and everything.
Okay.
One of your children was having a birthday party, and you went over to Balboa Island and you bought a bag or several bags of shells, and you put them around Shark Island, and the kids had to go search out the shells and found about half of them.
Yeah.
Right, the second half, which I don't, like I said, I don't know if Mom ever told you this, is that her friends, Phyllis and Aisel Oaf, who lived like 2 doors down from what would become the gate to Linda Isle. She was a shell collector and was, major into seashells. And she had someone who was a shell expert, an international science shell expert, that come to visit her, right? And they walked around Shark Island and found all of these
The
shells.
South Sea Island shells.
South Sea Island shells, and this person was going, oh my God, how did these get here? And apparently, because she didn't know your side of the story,
Right, exactly.
right?
Right.
She thought that the currents, that there was some weird obscure
Sure,
current
of
that was
course.
bringing these South Sea shells
yeah.
up and planting them on
Yeah,
Shark Island.
Yeah. No, I heard there was a story in the Daily Pilot or something, one of the newspapers, about the shell that had been discovered.
Jean actually told me this story
Oh, you're kidding.
several years ago, and she was laughing about how they planted the shells, and then some international expert came along and theorized that the currents were somehow making their way through the jetty coming from the South Pacific and other continents, South Africa,
This
wherever.
pristine, polished shell.
This beautiful shells.
With all these alien shells that now became Linda Isle.
Yeah. And the 6 degrees of separation in that whole story is my mom,
Yeah.
who was the
That's
only
right.
one who knew both people involved in the
That's
story.
Yeah.
Oh boy, didn't we have fun?
Oh, we did.
Yeah, right.
We
did.
were always rolling over there and making forts and,
Well,
and
I
doing
know,
all
and you
kinds
could
of
just-
crazy things over there.
Yeah, it was really something. As we all feel like I mean, it's sort of sad because, not really, you can't think of it as sad because everything's fine now. It's fine the way it is, but my father owned the house next door, and then he bought this lot, and then
Oh,
in '61 we
so
built
you're
this
4,
house.
That's 3.
When
So
did your dad? When was your dad's the first house? What
Number
year?
37.
37 is when.
Right, yeah, next
Okay.
door. And so we had it open between the two of us. That's why I don't have a pier, is because he had a pier and we just all used it. And then we used this beach. And so my brother had 6 kids and they're all the same age as mine. And you probably remember because we had these gangs of,
I remember gangs of
People.
kids. Yeah.
but so it was sort of a unique circumstance that doesn't happen every day for a family to have that. And then now nobody can even afford to live on the beach.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Are Jim and Terry this Jim, Irvine and Terry are?
Tammy.
Tammy,
Oh,
Tammy.
Tammy is the one that's the same age.
And your
as
second
you?
daughter is Terry?
Okay.
And then,
Mike,
okay, that was his real name. We used to
Yeah.
call him Buzzy.
Buzzy, it was
Mike,
Yeah.
okay. And
John.
Lorna?
Lorna was baby.
was baby.
It was baby, Buzzy, Sissy, and Tammy. Tammy couldn't say, it, but so John Klug still calls Lorna baby. Yeah.
And the Overholts, they had their house just beyond, right? A little ways. Were they?
Yeah,
here
they were
early,
number
weren't they?
one.
Number one, yeah.
The other story Jim doesn't remember is my father was quite a unique soul, and Jim played the drums.
Yes.
So
yes.
you played the drums, and for a
Okay.
while you didn't have a drum-proof, soundproof room. I think your mom put a soundproof room or something because these drums would be beating out there. And one day when you were playing the drums, my dad came out in the backyard with 2 trash can lids and started.
Little percussion, huh? Little percussion.
That was
Yeah,
good.
I did have that drum set, which we can blame on my brother Bill, who gave me the drum set.
Do you still play?
No.
No. You really do need a soundproof room for drums, I'll tell you.
You could do electronic drums now and just wear headphones.
Sure, well, that's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, it was-
So the Overholts were number one, only because when my dad was alive and we were living out at the ranch house, we used to rent number one
oh,
during the summertime.
oh, okay.
And so this would have been the 50s. And come down here but I was little Jimmy. And so I can't remember whether it was a week or a month or what, but I know we would rent this house and come and stay down here during the summertime.
Yeah,
And it was number one.
yeah.
And,
Oh, I didn't remember they ever rented that thing, but I guess so.
well, then maybe it wasn't rented per se. I don't know. I just know we did some summertimes down there at number one.
Right.
Well, one of the nice later convergences was that Lou Overholt, as an adult, was a successful attorney with his practice in Anaheim and served on the Anaheim City Council for any number of terms, at least 2. and was the either appointed by Ralph B. Clark as the 4th District Representative to the Harbors, Beaches, and Parks Commission, or he was the League of Cities Inland Commissioner, because each of the 5 members of the Board of Supervisors appointed one commissioner, and then the League of Cities had 2 appointments, one for coastal and one for inland. And Llewellyn was the one who really spearheaded establishing what we now call the Marine Institute in Dana Point Harbor.
I know, he was very proud of that.
Yeah, that was, he was a real mover and shaker. A very, I would say, in all the years that I served the Harbor Commission, he and Jim DeMarco and maybe Sandy Boostrom and Sally White, who was the longest serving in the history, 22 years of that commission, were the finest minds, the most constructive, sensibly organized minds that could figure out how to do stuff and move it along without staff having to tell them what to do,
Yeah.
And,
Well, he,
now back in those days because Lou Overholt gave me, I was mentioning this to Harry, he gave me a glossy black and white 8x10 photo of, I guess your kids had pedalos down here in those days. Do you remember the pedalo boat? The boats that they would get into and paddle, pedal like on a push car. And there was this wonderful photograph of him in a pedalo as a kid with Yasha Heifetz's kids.
oh, sure.
And it was right off the little opening between the houses right down here.
Yeah.
Now, was Yasha still here in those days, or his family, or did the Amundsen's come by then that founded Home Savings and Loan and that was the successor to?
Well, Yasha was here, I can't think about, I don't know what years it was. His kids were, we played with their kids a little bit, and it would have been, I have no idea what year that got sold or anything.
Yeah.
Did you know them at all?
When you said that, it's like I recall that, but the Amundsens were here by the time we got here.
Oh, they were.
Because
Okay.
the son, who we called Steady? Steady, okay. Nicknames. He was also kind of my age, and
Yeah.
we'd hang out a little bit together.
Oh, he was odd as could be.
Yes.
What happened to you?
I don't.
This
I mean, I'm a
Howard
kid, so I
Amundsen
don't know what
founded
odd
Home
is. I haven't met
Savings
enough
and
people.
Loan.
I just
you
know
haven't met enough odd people?
He could have odd kids.
at that age. At that age.
Not
I
at
haven't-
that age, right.
Yeah,
no,
not at that
either.
age.
Yeah.
So,
No.
so I just knew that he wasn't, I don't know. I
He
just,
was
I
a
didn't,
little off,
yeah, I didn't see him often,
yeah.
but we'd see
The
each other
teachers
once in a
at
while.
Harbor, at Corona Del Mar Elementary, one time, I got involved in the PTA over there, so I knew them all, and they had this joke about Harbor Island. They wanted to cut it off and send it out to sea because there were so many strange kids that came from Harbor Island. But there was what was that family down there? I mean, he was a mentally retarded guy, which was not awful, but then the Flager boy
Oh yeah, Tommy
Tommy.
Flager, right?
was a problem.
Yeah.
He used to sit in his room and shoot stuff from some little gun at the kids as they went by to school. And then there was the other one, there was somebody else. It's been an interesting, if
There
I
was
would
a-
stop long enough to ever write a story, I could really,
Now, were the were the Crispins on Harbor Island in those days, or did they come later?
they came later.
Thayer Crispin, that was my dad's boss, the Douglas.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
They
And
came-
were the McNabs here in the 50s, or?
They would have been.
Okay.
Yeah, they were in Beacon Bay with us, and then they came over here. We came here in '61. They would have come shortly after that, probably.
Now, Was this a vacant lot when you built this house, or
Yeah.
okay?
Yep,
And your parents' older home was next door then, right?
right.
Okay.
That's right.
At number 3, would it be number 3, something like that?
Number 3, and then this house was a really nice little shingled house. You had, some of it was 2-story, but it was, you know, a modest
Yeah.
house,
Yeah,
really.
it was half 2-story, and it was only the front. There was like a 1-story guest house on the street side, and then a
Yeah.
patio in the middle.
Yeah,
And then we had the flagstone, and then we had 2 layers of beach. We had a retaining wall in between, so we had a big chunk of beach.
yeah,
And I think we had a common wooden fence between us.
yeah. It was all very friendly then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of, everybody's closed off from each other now. It's, you know, and my father, one time I was down visiting a friend on the other end of the island who didn't know us, my parents at all. And here comes this guy, looks a little like Mahatma Gandhi in his bathing suit, skinny, dark. And he's wandering around the island on the beach because you could walk all the way around.
Right.
So my father had this wood pile in the backyard, and he would go around and collect driftwood, and then he had his wood pile to burn in his fireplace. And here he comes, and my friend's mother said, "Who is that?" You know, she thought it was some vagrant walking around our island. So it's changed, let's just put it that way, because it was, I mean, when you were here, we could walk all the way around.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with all the bulkheads, and it annoys me because I don't know what the arrangement was for Linda Isle, for instance, because I assume they do not pay tideland fees to the county, because they have no tidelands.
Uh-huh.
Did the Irvine company have to, I mean, they just came, they got scot-free. They're built on the tidelands, but they don't have to pay any fees.
Oh.
Is that right?
I don't know the details about Linda Isle.
No.
Yeah.
Neither do I.
Yeah.
Well, and neither does anyone, and nobody's ever
Ask
questioned
Linda, it was
because-
named after her.
It is. That's a good question.
It is named after Jim's sister, Linda Irvine.
And she or someone going back
At the Irvine Company, the gentleman
Oh, yeah.
who did, when we were at Nita's funeral, there were the 2 older gentlemen who
They wrote a
worked
book.
with Ray Watson on the original planning.
Oh, okay.
And they might have an answer to that question.
Well, somebody does, I'm sure, but it basically is one of the unfairnesses of all of the tidelands issues. It's such a can of worms that nobody could ever dig into it thoroughly. I know Frank Robinson wanted to really take it on, and I mean, we have fee title to this stuff that's shouldn't have probably, and but it's all grandfathered in.
Well, there's one concept, if I recall correctly now, just some of this is coming back to me. There's something called emerged lands and submerged lands.
Oh,
And the submerged lands, which are obviously got water over them, at least, twice a day at high tide, and maybe wet when it's not high tide, versus the emerged lands, which are above that wet zone. And when emerged lands evolve by virtue of wind blowing sand onto them to raise the elevation, or wave action pushing sand up, or in the case of man-made islands, filled, like Balboa, because I remember My dad always told me that Balboa was just a mud patch when my grandparents got their property there in 1905. They used to row from what is now Bayside Drive. There was no bridge. You rowed across it
Yeah.
to get to it, and it was just modest little cottages, like early homes that would be on Balboa Peninsula and that kind of thing. But it may have something to do with the emerged versus the submerged, particularly in the case of Harbor Island, because obviously it's older. Right? Yeah.
Well, I don't expect that it's, unless the tsunami merges it again, submerges it again.
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. $5,000 was a lot of money.
It's a
in
lot of money,
77.
and nobody had that kind of money,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
they were begging everybody. So we all should have bought more lots.
Because
At any one point in time.
it has sort of outpaced inflation, huh?
It has, really. I think the Beaks kept one lot for themselves, which was the one on the very end,
Oh, next to
On the
Gladys
other end.
Gardner.
where the lighthouse.
Where the light, okay, that was Beaks, okay.
And they
that's why it
sold
wasn't
it for $400,000. And it was, maybe, I don't know, in the 80s or something. It wasn't when we bought. It wasn't then. They sold it later.
Yeah.
Because for a long time we encouraged Barton to move over here, but he never did. And so that was, really, it's crazy.
Where did the Beaks, mom and pop Beak live in Newport? Do you know?
Where did they live?
Where did they live in Newport Beach?
Well, they lived right across from a peninsula on Balboa Island.
Okay,
And Seymour still lives there.
okay.
The first thing they wanted to do was to, the island people, they hired Dennis O'Neill, and Dennis's brilliant idea was to get Marion Ferguson to carry legislation so that we could buy tideland some other place. Replace ours and not have to pay a fee for ours, but having bought some cheaper thing somewhere else. And I thought, that doesn't sound very focused, I think that's illegal, which it turned out to be illegal. And it turned out that they couldn't do that anyway, so then we got into the dialogue.
This program is among the efforts recognized in the Lifetime Achievement Award from the President of the United States in 2015. Supplemental information on the history of the Orange County Park System is included in the California State University Fullerton Center for Oral and Public History, interview number 2061 of Eric Jessen by Joanna Brand, published in 2008.